What sort of person was Jack the Ripper? Some might think that this is an impossible question to answer, as the culprit was never caught, but I'll look at the crimes, how they were committed, where they were committed, the time they were committed, and the victims themselves to see what we might be able to discern as to the type of culprit we should be looking for, and equally what we shouldn't be looking for. Although I'll reference other Whitechapel murders, in this film I'll mainly restrict myself to the so-called canonical five. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. They're the victims most commonly attributed to the serial killer known to history as Jack the Ripper, but I personally think these were not the only murders committed by Jack the Ripper. A senior politically appointed policeman at Scotland Yard, Melville Macnaughton, wrote in an internal memorandum in 1894 that famously said, "Now the Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims, and 5 victims only." Although in as early as December 1888 it had variously been reported that the police are of the opinion that the last 5 murders were a series and that the first 2 were independently perpetrated. The appendage of the word canonical was coined by the late Martin Fido in 1987, and I personally don't like the term, but I'll use it as a shorthand way of referring to these 5 victims. So the canonical 5 were all murdered in a very tight geographical area. Barely a mile separated them. There must be a reason for this. Why weren't they spread over the rest of the East End? In Bethnal Green, for example, or in the West End, or in other port areas such as the South Bank. There must logically be a common denominator which links these crime scenes to the murderer. He must have had access to these sites. He must have chosen to commit the murders in that specific area for some reason. This district was the most overcrowded part of London, as identified by Charles Booth in his survey of London poverty. This makes it all the more surprising that the culprit was able to carry out these crimes undetected, and reinforces the suggestion that the culprit deliberately chose to commit the crimes in that specific district rather than in a less crowded area where the chances of detection would have been less. Significantly, there are indications that in the cases of Nichols and Stride, the culprit was disturbed, yet he continued to commit his murders in the same area. The crimes took place at night when it was very dark. Killing at night when the streets were comparatively empty was realistically the killer's only option. He could have hardly perpetrated these crimes in broad daylight. But darkness is very disorientating. This again suggests the culprit was very familiar with the streets, which provided him with a maximum sense of security and confidence. He would not get lost in what would otherwise be unfamiliar back streets and alleyways. As these crimes were nocturnal, the killer probably had a ready excuse to be on the streets at that time. It was most likely his natural habitat, which would have provided him with a ready excuse if questioned. For the killer to have specifically chosen to be out just for the purpose of murder, it would probably imply that he was single, or his late night forays would have been noticed. If he was a working class man who worked in normal daylight hours, nighttime murderous escapades would have perhaps been problematic. Not everyone who lived in or knew the East End was employed in long-houred working class occupations, but the overwhelming majority were. Prior to committing the first murder, in cases of this type, it's usual for the culprit to go through a lengthy process of fantasising about the act, playing it through in his mind, probably countless times, working out what he would do and how he would do it, how easy it would be for him to get away with it. At arm's length, this is difficult, if not impossible to do, hence the likelihood that the culprit regularly walked those streets beforehand, visualising committing murder, thinking about what he wanted to do before he actually did it. With his escape and evasion, if the culprit had to travel a considerable distance to his house, bolt hole or whatever secure location was available to him after committing murder, then it increased his risks, particularly if he had blood on him. Logically, the place of refuge could not have been too far away. This further reinforces the suggestion that the killer was local. A killer living some distance away and choosing to kill in the East End rather than more locally to him was taking a huge and unnecessary extra risk of being caught. If he was of respectable background, any traces of blood would show up more. Working class people tended to wear cast-off second-hand clothes and have few changes of clothes. They would tend to be naturally grimy, and any blood would merge in more unnoticeably than on a respectable man's clothing. A respectable man would tend to lodge in clean and tidy lodgings, again some distance from the East End, and where any blood would show up much more easily. There were public fountains and water troughs dotted about the East End and in the vicinity of the crime scenes. This could potentially have assisted in washing off any blood that may have been about the culprit's person, but again, local knowledge would be useful in being able to identify the nearest such site. All of these factors point in the same direction and reinforce the logical conclusion that the killer was local. The killer must have felt comparatively safe and confident in those specific streets. If not local, he must have had a very good and intimate knowledge of that specific area of the East End, and the implication is that the killer must have almost certainly been working class. The investigative efforts of the police on the ground were certainly focused in this sensible direction. For example, a door-to-door inquiry was carried out after the double event, encompassing a large chunk of Spitalfields and Whitechapel. On the subject of the local police, familiarity with local police beats and the pattern by which beats were conducted would have been very useful in assisting in the culprit's escape and evasion from the crime scenes. I will borrow a few quotations from an important symposium on serial murder held in August 2005, organised by the FBI's Behavioural Analysis Unit 2. With respect to a local killer, the following was said. Most serial killers have very defined geographic areas of operation. They conduct their killings within comfort zones that are often defined by an anchor point, e.g. place of residence, employment or residence of a relative. Serial murderers will at times spiral their activities outside of their comfort zone, where their confidence has grown through experience or to avoid detection. Very few serial murderers travel interstate to kill. The few serial killers who do travel interstate to kill fall into a few categories. Itinerant individuals who move from place to place, homeless individuals who are transients, individuals whose employment lends itself to interstate or transnational travel, such as truck drivers or those in military service. The difference between these types of offenders and other serial murderers is the nature of their travelling lifestyle, which provides them with many zones of comfort in which to operate. So, making allowance for modern American language, if the culprit isn't local, then it would have been someone who, for whatever reason, developed great familiarity with the East End through some other means. The killer must have been plausible to the victims, someone who didn't encourage suspicion, someone who they felt relaxed with. Perhaps the victim vaguely knew them, possibly as an ex-punter, or they just knew the type of person that the killer was, and so was not overly suspicious of them. This must have been the case with the murders after Polly Nichols. It must be remembered that Polly Nichols was at the time regarded as being the third murder victim, and it is from her death that we see the onset of public hysteria, and this rose even more when Annie Chapman was murdered 8 days later. So the culprit must have been someone who did not attract suspicion. He must have acted reasonably normally and could not have been overtly mad. There was a lot of talk that the culprit was foreign or Jewish, so again the victim would likely be on her guard more with such a potential culprit. The FBI Serial Murder Symposium debunked the following myth that is still widely believed. Serial killers are all dysfunctional loners. The majority of serial killers are not reclusive social misfits who live alone. They are not monsters and may not appear strange. Many serial killers hide in plain sight within their communities. Serial murderers often have families and homes, are gainfully employed, and appear to be normal members of the community. Because many serial murderers can blend in so effortlessly, they are oftentimes overlooked by law enforcement and the public. That normality was what almost certainly allowed the culprit to both pick up his victims and pass the local police unnoticed. The killer engaged in overkill with a high degree of piquerism, multiple penetrative stabbing or slashing with particular attention to the sexual organs. This suggests a sexual motive. But was it hatred or its opposite, some sort of frustrated desire, that was at the root of this? When a psychopathic man kills a woman, it's by no means certain that misogyny is the cause. Besides any other factors, these mutilations discount any suggestion for a Jill the Ripper. And it also makes it unlikely that the killer was gay. Gay men usually kill other gay men rather than women. And when they kill women, you would not expect to see a sexual angle to the killing ritual. At the time, it was believed that gays were sexually mad. This was the main thesis in a very influential book published in 1886 by Dr. Richard Kraft Ebbing called Psychopathia Sexualis. This brings us to the subject of psychopathy. It is almost certainly the case that the killer was a psychopath. Virtually all serial killing cases of this type are committed by psychopaths. Of course, the vast majority of psychopaths don't kill. They get their kicks out of doing down other people, in business or politics, for example, or perhaps through running an online Jack the Ripper forum. Some, who are also weak and unintelligent, remain forever thwarted. Psychopaths are very difficult to identify with any certainty unless they act in an abhorrent and uncontrolled manner which leads to their arrest or being subjected to psychiatric examination. While psychopathy is a mental illness, overt madness is, however, very unlikely to be present. Again, from the FBI Symposium, another myth that exists is that serial killers have either a debilitating mental condition. As a group, serial killers suffer from a variety of personality disorders, including psychopathy, antisocial personality and others. Most, however, are not adjudicated as insane under the law. Attendees felt it was very important for law enforcement and other professionals in the criminal justice system to understand psychopathy and its relationship to serial murder. Psychopaths who commit serial murder do not value human life and are extremely callous in their interactions with their victims. This is particularly evident in sexually motivated serial killers who repeatedly target, stalk, assault and kill without a sense of remorse. Psychopaths are not sensitive to altruistic interview themes such as sympathy for the victims or remorse, guilt over their crimes. So while the killer is likely to be a psychopath, as there's obviously no opportunity to examine any of the potential suspects, we can't draw any conclusions from this, except to say that we should not be looking for an overt madman, someone diagnosed at the time as being a lunatic. Many viewers will be familiar with an earlier FBI report from 1988, conducted by John Douglas with the assistance of Roy Hazelwood, where they profiled Jack the Ripper. Interestingly, Hazelwood, by then retired, attended the 2005 symposium. The 1988 report was highly prescriptive in a way that the symposium, with nearly 20 years more investigative experience, cautioned against. The 1988 report famously suggested of the culprit he expressed his pent-up destructive emotions by setting fires and torturing animals. How many times have I seen this misleading suggestion proposed since then? It also stated, "We would not expect this type of offender to be married." As we've already seen, this sort of hard-edged generalisation has been totally discarded. In conformity with outdated and unrealistic visualisations of the culprit as a bloodthirsty lunatic, it is sometimes still proposed that the 5 murders represented an escalation in brutality as expressed in the post-mortem mutilations undertaken by the killer, and that this upward curve must have resulted in a denouement soon afterwards with the death or incarceration of Jack the Ripper. After all, how could the killer go back to normal life after the bloodbath at Miller's Court, where Mary Kelly was literally torn apart? This attitude was encapsulated by Melville McNaughton. It will be noted that the fury of the mutilations increased in each case, and seemingly the appetite only became sharpened by indulgence. It seems then highly improbable that the murderer would have suddenly stopped in November 88. A much more rational theory is that the murderer's brain gave way altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court, and that he immediately committed suicide, or, as a possible alternative, was found to be so hopelessly mad by his relations that he was by them confined in some asylum. I don't think it's true that serial killers usually escalate in the ferocity of their overkill, nor do they tend to go blatantly mad as a result of their murders. This is a Victorian melodramatic fantasy, unless you can show me different, of course, with an exception to the rule. Tell me if I'm wrong. But many people still follow Macnaghten and expect this to be the case. If we look at the 5 canonical murders, what do we have? Polly Nichols, comparatively minor abdominal injuries, but there are strong indications that the killer was disturbed and did not finish what he had set out to achieve. Annie Chapman, very extensive abdominal wounds. Liz Stride, no abdominal wounds at all, but again there are signs the killer had been disturbed. Catherine Eddowes, very extensive abdominal injuries, similar to those inflicted upon Annie Chapman, but also facial mutilations, possibly out of anger at being disturbed with Stride, as this was the second murder that same night as part of the double event. Mary Kelly, very extensive mutilation affecting the whole body, but this was conducted indoors, so the culprit had more opportunity to engage in more drastic mutilation. If we add other Whitechapel murders to the sequence, which are often included by observers at the time and students of the case more recently, we get an altogether different picture with no pattern of progression at all. And don't forget, the 5 are almost deliberately selected by Macnaghten to conform to his own preconceptions. Martha Tabram, extensive abdominal injuries and extreme overkill. Polly Nichols, relatively minor, shows de-escalation. Annie Chapman, extensive, escalation. Liz Stride, no abdominal injuries, de-escalation. Catherine Eddowes, extensive, escalation. Mary Kelly, very extensive, escalation. Alice Mackenzie, minor abdominal injuries, de-escalation. If you look at this sequence, the degree of overkill is dependent upon the circumstances available to the killer, whether or not he was disturbed. This seems to be the picture we have, rather than an escalation with each case ending in an awful glut. This begs the question, should we be looking for a killer who was arrested and incarcerated or died soon after 1888, if not because their mind collapsed, but because the series of murders seemingly ended abruptly? I return to the FBI symposium again. It has been widely believed that once serial killers start killing, they cannot stop. There are, however, some serial killers who stop murdering altogether before being caught. In these instances, there are events or circumstances in offenders' lives that inhibit them from pursuing more victims. These can include increased participation in family activities, sexual substitution, or other diversions. As I mentioned, the FBI symposium was in 2005. Since then, advances in DNA technology have enabled several high-profile cold cases to be solved where the killer stopped for indeterminate reasons. For example, the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, and the presumed Long Island serial killer Rex Heuermann. He hasn't come to trial yet. With dozens of serial killer cases remaining unsolved in the United States, it seems likely that a great many serial killers stopped, remained undetected, and lived out their lives. Various other suggestions have been made, such as Fenian or anarchist conspiracies, but to perpetrate these murders for those purposes implies a psychopathic mindset. Or was the killer schizophrenic? Schizophrenic murderers invariably get caught after their first murder or murder spree, as they don't tend to plot their escape and evasion at all. The victims were killed with a knife. Does this suggest that the killer must have had access to a knife, and does the suspect having access to a knife through his profession perhaps add to his potential guilt? Hardly. Serial killers or murderers in general who kill using knives seldom if ever do so due to special access to a knife. Knives were and are quite easy to obtain by anyone minded to use one on another human being. Should the killer have surgical skills or anatomical skills? This is a controversial subject. Of the main police suspects, none qualified in that regard, although the police seem to have harboured the mistaken idea that Druitt was a doctor. So the police had no special adherence to the theory that the killer must have had surgical skills. Kosminski, for example, was a hairdresser, and it's been suggested that while in Russian Poland he may have been a barber surgeon, where he may have learnt such skills. But Kosminski was only 16 when he left Russia, and the Metropolitan Police can hardly have been expected to believe that an adolescent Russian barber could have learnt surgical skills. Having such skills, perhaps in the animal butchering trade, might be thought to be an advantage for a potential suspect, but this aspect can't be a deal breaker. A police surgeon, Dr. Thomas Bond, noted, "In each case the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer or any person accustomed to cut up dead animals." This was actually part of a wider report regarded as being one of the first attempts at profiling, but when he addressed the character of the culprit, he made the same misinformed assumptions that were common in that period. He must, in my opinion, be a man subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. The character of the mutilations indicate that the man may be in a condition sexually that may be called satyriasis. What was behind the killer's selection of his victims? Did he have a hatred for prostitutes or women in general? You quite often see this claim that so-and-so is a good suspect because he might have had syphilis. The diagnosis is seldom conclusive, and that this would have encouraged a specific grudge against prostitutes with revenge as the motive. It's not unknown for this to be the case, but it is rare. For example, Cornelius Berger murdered 5 prostitutes in South Africa between 1936 and 1937, supposedly in revenge for contracting syphilis. Most serial killers select their victims based on them being easier to overpower. Hence, children or women are the usual victims. It's not necessarily because the killer hates children or women. It's a question of who they can practically more easily subdue. That is incidentally why suggestions that the killer might turn on a man who perhaps interrupted him and kill that man with the same knife are almost certainly way wide of the mark. The idea of attacking another man would be very far from the thoughts or instincts of this killer. So what are we looking for in the broadest terms? Someone who's very comfortable with all the crime scene locations, all of which were in close proximity, and who felt confident of operating in those areas in the dark. Someone who is also confident that he could repeatedly and successfully carry out these crimes even when there was a very good chance of him being disturbed due to the high density population. He must have known every alley and escape route and the types of people he was likely to bump into. Knowledge of the police beats through observation, or possibly knowledge of police procedures, would have given him an extra layer of confidence. Someone who had good reason to be out on the streets at the times the crimes were committed. He must have seemed unthreatening and familiar, if not personally familiar, to the victims themselves. They must have felt at their ease with him, even when the Ripper hysteria was at its height. Yet when he killed, the mutilation and the extent of the attack betrays a fixation with the sexual act and sexual organs. We should not be looking for someone who hates women, but someone who has a complicated relationship with women. We should not be looking for someone who's gay. Overt madmen would almost certainly be incapable of successfully committing a series of crimes in these densely populated streets and getting away with it. Nor would an overt madman have been able to gain the confidence of a victim to be taken to a secluded spot where he could carry out his murderous intent. Criminals, as a subset of the overall population, are no more prone to being a serial killer than anyone else, so we shouldn't specifically look there. Serial killers are quite unlike ordinary criminals. Flamboyant characters, people that were unusual or stood out from the crowd, can be pretty much discounted as they drew attention to themselves. We know the police investigation focused on butchers, slaughtermen and lodging house dwellers, with people in these categories being questioned most closely and so have to be less likely as suspects. The local, unassuming, outwardly industrious, working class family man who had an excuse to be out in the early hours of the morning, who was used to being out at that time, who knew the very specific areas where these crimes were committed like the back of his hand, who had knowledge of how the police operated, and whose family was involved in something akin to the horse meat business. That's who we should be looking for. Can anyone think of a name? Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and share, like and ring that notification bell, and comment below. Do you agree with this summary?